Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's CECAN webinar. I'm Carina Elsenbroich. I'm a reader in computational modeling at the University of Glasgow, and I'm a co-investigator on the CECAN project, and I'm co-director of the SIPHER Consortium, of which we will hear a little bit more in the presentation. For those of you who haven't joined us before, CECAN stands for the Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus, which has been transforming the practice of policy evaluation across the food, energy, water, and environmental domains to make them fit for a complex world. And how we've done that is really by pioneering, testing, and promoting innovative policy evaluation approaches, working closely with UK government departments. And if you want to find out more about CECAN, there's a website, cecan.ac.uk. Now, today's webinar is about a synthetic population of the UK. That's a synthetic data set based on the UK Census, but enriched with survey data from Understanding Society. And this synthetic population is part of the SIPHER project, of SIPHER Consortium outputs, which is applying system science in public health and economic research. SIPHER is focused on tackling health inequalities through economic inclusion, improvement in housing, and public mental health. And the synthetic population is one of the backbones of the research of SIPHER. Just very briefly, some housekeeping. Please submit your questions at any point via the question box that will be open to you to participate in. And there is a voting up function. I think that is turned on, so you can look through the questions while you're listening, and you can vote up the ones that you think should be asked. In the Q&A session, we'll look into the box and ask Nick all the relevant questions. And the session will be recorded and will be made available later on the CECAN website, along with the slides. Okay, so just to get over to the important bit of today. We're delighted to have Nick Lomax presenting this webinar. Nick is a professor of population geography at the University of Leeds, and his research interests are in high-resolution demographic modeling, providing demographic expertise at the core of applied research, investigating how people behave, interact, and are impacted by policy and changes in their environment. He's part of the SIPHER Consortium, focused on health in all policy, as I said already, sort of economic inclusion, etc. And he's the director of the Consumer Data Research Centre, which is an ESRC investment that bridges academia and industry to produce insight into consumer behaviour. And he's a fellow of the Alan Turing Institute, where he has advanced the coupling of demographic and applied models in open source frameworks. So over to you, Nick, for the presentation.
Carina, thank you very much for the introduction, and hello everyone, thanks for joining us. So Carina has mentioned the consortium which funds this work and which both Carina and I are a part of, which is SIPHER. So I won't say all that much more about the consortium until the end when I acknowledge the funders and the partners, but what I really want to do today is focus on one of our, what we call data products, which is a synthetic population. This is the product of three years of work to produce a data set which is useful in its own right, but also useful as an input to other things. So what I really want to do today is to give you, in the first part of my presentation, a bit of an overview about what the rationale for doing what we've done and some information about the methodology, although it will be necessarily fairly high level. And I can always point you towards the methodology documents and the papers and that kind of thing. And then what I intend to do is spend the second part of the presentation talking through some of the utility of the data product that we've produced. So hopefully, if I can give you a good feel for what we've done and why we've done it, I can then give you a good feel for where it might be useful. And I'm really hoping that that might inspire you to get hold of it, because I'll talk at the end about how we are making this open source product available to the research community for kind of anything that you can imagine you would be able to use it for, really. So let's start off then with the kind of the rationale and the methods for what we've been doing. So this is variously referred to as a digital twin or a synthetic twin of the population. So this slide gives you the high level overview of what we think we're doing. So we're creating a synthetic population for individuals in Great Britain. So that is individual units that are people. And we combine the survey data with population statistics from the census. And I'll talk through the various data sets. And what we think we have is a product which is representative across a wide number of variables. And I'm going to come back to the map that I'm showing on the right-hand side in a minute. But this is Glasgow City region, and it gives you a feel for the sort of spatial detail that's available in our new synthetic data set. So the first couple of slides are a little bit wordy, but it is important to get us onto the same page as to the why and the background to what we're doing. So we argue very strongly that health outcomes for subgroups across different geographies and for any sort of disaggregation you might be interested in, we need to be able to build bespoke groupings from individual level data. So starting at that individual level unit for the models that we want to build. We know that those individuals, they have distinct characteristics, distinct behaviors, and they accumulate their own unique histories of exposures or experiences. So this is not a group level thing. This is an individual level thing that's very important for modeling health outcomes in our context. But this is where the problem arises, because there is not any good quality individual level data outside of secure settings, especially not covering large portions of the population or that are kind of GB wide. And there are good reasons for that. You know, these are data that you would not want to have outside of secure settings if they were kind of the real information. So what we've done is we've created a synthetic data set which gives us a representative version of the things that we need. So there are detailed attributes that we can model on, but they're not the kind of the real data. And I think that's really important to stress at this point. So the broad solution that we're using comes under a very broad heading of a methodology called microsimulation. Now, I won't go through the history of this in any detail, but I want to kind of take you back to the 1950s. So the kind of grandfather of the broad set of solutions called microsimulation was an economist called Guy Orcutt. And he was an American econometrician, and he was very frustrated with the limitations of the macroeconomic models for assessing impacts of policy simulations. So he recognized that all of those macro approaches largely ignored distributional effects. And he argued that any of our theoretical models for socioeconomic systems need to be applied at the individual level, because it's the individuals who make decisions within the system. And there is a whole load of literature that builds from here, which is microsimulation in a really large range of different applied contexts. So just to give you a flavor, this is not a kind of a new invention. The microsimulation methodologies have been applied across transport, for example, through logistics and commuting, in health, so creating synthetic data to estimate access to GP services and elderly morbidity, used broadly in wider policy analysis. So there is a growing interest in using microsimulation for population projection, estimating poverty rates. And then there are a couple of references that are kind of really nice overviews of the history, which I can share later on. So I am going to talk about methods, but I am going to talk in a fairly high level way here, just so that we can get through a lot of material. So we are now focusing down on a piece of the microsimulation puzzle, which is called spatial microsimulation. So quite simply, spatial microsimulation is the point at which we're interested in creating spatially representative data, which we can use for our analysis. So this is a slide that I've been teaching to master's students for a couple of years, and it's the first thing I show them. So I say, if you think about the kinds of data that we have available to us, on the left-hand side, we've got sample or survey data, which is very detailed information about individuals. So you might know that individual's hobbies, you might know that individual's age, their health outcomes, etc., etc. We then have a whole other set of information, which is represented on the right-hand side, which we're calling the target or constraining data. Now, these are data that have good spatial information, but are typically less detailed in terms of their attributes. So you might know the the distribution of age by sex, age by ethnicity, ethnicity by health. And these are all things that we would readily take from census, or when it comes to the population totals, from things like mid-year estimates. And the point of spatial microsimulation is that by combining the best of both worlds, the information from the survey and the spatial information from the target constraining data set, you can produce something which is a synthetic representation that is now spatially accurate and also attribute rich. So when we're talking about the CIPHER synthetic population I'm presenting today, we use some really key data sets. So we've got survey data, which comes from Understanding Society, which is a representative household panel survey. And I'll talk in a minute a bit more about Understanding Society. We then have population statistics that come from the UK Census 2011, 2021, or 2022 in Scotland, and the mid-year population estimates that are spatially disaggregated. We then use a spatial microsimulation technique called simulated annealing. And again, I'll talk briefly about that in just a moment, which gives us our synthetic population. And if you are interested in QR codes and links, if you take a scan of that picture there, it takes you to the Nature Scientific Data paper, which describes the baseline methodology for creating this synthetic data set. But again, I'll come back at the end and provide an option for the links through to the paper. And what does it look like? Well, it's a bit like this. So we've got, as I say, a whole population, which is represented within a census. We've got a sample population, which is represented within Understanding Society. And what we have created is the bit in the middle, which is this whole synthetic population, which is the best of both worlds. So I'm going to talk about the algorithm in about 1 minute. So we use something which is called simulated annealing, and it's a combinatorial optimization type algorithm. And if you can imagine a model setup whereby you have all of your constraints that come from your census, so age by sex, age by ethnicity, and all of the other things that we can get at area level. And then you've got a set of matching attributes that come from the survey. You fit a list of individuals into areas, and then you look at the fit between the two data sets. And where you can improve that fit, i.e. all of those joint distributions can be improved, you swap individuals out from the survey and back in again. And you keep going and keep going and keep going until you have a set of individuals that match the constraints, which then gives you your synthetic population. And the algorithm is called simulated annealing because it's analogous to the annealing of metal. So in this particular algorithm, you can imagine that as you get closer to your kind of optimal solution, the opportunity to swap decreases, so you don't get stuck in kind of local optima. And if you were hitting a piece of metal, the colder it got, the less malleable it would be. So it's a nice name for an algorithm that does the job for us. And that's all I'm going to say on it. There are some really good papers that describe the algorithm in more detail if you're interested in following it up. So it's worth saying something about the underlying Understanding Society dataset that we are using, because it's a really good quality dataset, and that's really important when it comes to trying to create good quality synthetic outputs. So it's around 40,000 households, or it was at its inception, and it's been going since 2009, 2010. So we have 13 waves of data. A huge range of topics sit in there, so around family and employment, health, and a whole range of other modules as well. It's repeated visits and repeated observations, so you can build up a longitudinal view of individual and household attributes and conditions. And we've got Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. There's a reason why we are GB and not UK, which is that some of the constraints for Northern Ireland don't match up particularly well. So it's unfortunate, but we've ended up with a population data set that is GB, not UK, for some very good reasons that are methodologically sound. So that's all I want to say on Understanding Society for now, apart from to kind of make the point that when we've created our data, we end up with a very vast connection of attributes, which I'm going to come back to in a couple of minutes when I talk about validation. But if you were to go to the Understanding Society webpage and look at the the attributes that are available, we have effectively pulled through a huge number of those. So it's a very rich synthetic data set, but some of those attributes are more useful than others, as we'll see in a minute. So I talked about the algorithm and the alignment. So if you can imagine that we've got kind of constraint dimensions that are around ethnicity, marital status, highest qualifications, health, household tenure. There are variables that match up in understanding society and also match up in the census. So the column in the middle is the understanding society variable, and the column on the right-hand side is the census table. And that's how we make sure that we're aligning to those targets. The variables that we are using add up. When we've done all of that work, what we spit out at the first step is a very boring file. It's a 2-column file, which in essence gives you a spatial identifier. So in the case of what we've built here, it's LSOA level, lower super output area level for England and Wales, and it's data zone level for Scotland. And then we have a person ID, which is the person ID that's pulled through from Understanding Society, the survey. Now, this is not unique because if you can imagine the way that we've created this, you have lots and lots of replications of individuals that, when you add them up, fit your area level constraints. So we've got a table which is around 55 million rows, where one row is for every synthetic individual. And then the real power comes when you merge this file back with Understanding Society, because that will then allow you to do the analysis that you really want to do. And once you've merged it back in, it looks something like this. So you can merge it with the household or the individual files. So not only do you have a zone ID and a person ID, but you then have age, sex, health outcomes, all sorts of other things like whether that person has problems paying council tax. So you can start to see the richness of the data that's been created. We do a lot of work on kind of quality control. There's some literature that suggests that kind of 90% of microsimulation work is validation and quality control. And it's important to stress that because you're creating something that doesn't necessarily exist, you have to validate very carefully. And there are 2 obvious ways of doing it. One is internal validation. So does the underpinning joinery work? Does the alignment of constraints match? So are your distributions retained, etc.? And the algorithm should retain all of those things, but it's important to check them, and we have. And then you have external validation. So we've done quite a lot of comparison against information that's not used in the microsimulation process. So do our outputs correlate with things like the index of multiple deprivation data from the Department for Work and Pensions? And we've done that validation, and we think it does align with external kind of comparisons. This is an example of that external comparison where we're looking at the working age population, age 16 to 74, in different types of occupation. So where we're comparing this against external data that have not been used in our construction, you can see that we are fairly good for the kind of the key headlines. So managerial and professional, intermediate, small employers, lower supervisory, semi-routine type of occupations. But we found that where you've got a kind of catch-all, all other, our synthetic population is overestimating the distribution there. So the point here is that you have to be kind of careful in the way that you use these data. So where you are interested in the relationship between kind of occupation and other outcomes, you want to check what the distributions look like for those particular variables, and you would probably attach far more kind of uncertainty to the other catch-all category than you would to, for example, small employers and own account workers. So what we've done is we kind of class our data into 4 different levels. So we've got variables in there that we think we have got very high confidence in. So this is where the data have actually been used as a constraint. So they've come from both the census and mid-year estimate and from the underlying survey data. So that's things like age, sex, education, employment that I showed you in the previous tables. So where we've used the data as a constraint target or benchmark, we've got very high confidence because we know that we're always hitting the benchmarks that we need to. We then have variables that we have high confidence in, but need to be used with caution, because basically all of these data need to be used with caution. But these are where we have strong associations with the utilized constraints. So occupational groups, financial hardship, health risk factors, that kind of thing. We've then got a classification of variables where we don't really know, but they are very likely to be problematic. So this is where you're looking at very specific characteristics on individuals or areas. So there are, believe it or not, some variables in understanding society, like, you know, swimming in the sea, visiting historical places. These are variables that we have no way of validating and haven't tried to validate. So I think caution is needed if you want to do something really, really niche and specific with the data set. And then the last category is where we would say unknown, but probably reasonable. So there is some information in there around kind of decoration of the house, whether you have noisy neighbours. The sample that they're asked, these questions are asked of in Understanding Society, is fairly large. So within reason, you probably could use these kinds of variables. But I think this is the point at which we pass the onus over to the user. So we'll say we've done all of the validations that we can on a lot of this, but if you really want to use these data for something specific, you need to be carefully validating the data to make sure that it's kind of got the distributions you need for your own analysis. So I'll re-emphasize that was all fairly high level because I wanted to get through quite a lot of methodological detail, but hopefully it gives you a flavour for the reason for doing this, and also the ways that we've gone about creating our synthetic population data product. This next part is where I really want to focus down on some of the utility of our data. So I'm going to draw on a few examples of things that we are doing with it. And I really hope that this gives you an opportunity to think about where these data might be useful for projects that you're involved in, because we do want, you know, the data to be used in different ways. So this is the most obvious place to start, really. So a good example of utility is where you think you need more spatially detailed analysis of something than you have in the published data that's available from elsewhere. So, for example, if you were interested in employment rates because you were looking at the association between employment rates and some other outcome, whether that be a health or an economic outcome, and you went to NOMIS, the annual, and got out the annual population survey for your year of interest, you would be able to get local authority level information on employment rates. So here we're looking at Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which is the local authorities that make up Greater Manchester. And I've highlighted specifically Bolton there in the northwest, because on the left-hand side, if you're just looking at local authority level, it looks like employment rates are fairly low, okay, relative to other places in Manchester. If you go to the right-hand side map, you're looking at the same variable, but within our synthetic population data set. And if you look at the place in the northwest where Bolton is, you can see that there is spatial variation across that local authority. So in the kind of more rural northern parts of that local authority, you have relatively high employment. Whereas if you look at the more kind of inner city areas in the middle of the local authority, you have lower employment. So I'm probably not telling you many things that you don't know, but without having the data available, you can't start to test some of the things that you want to test. So this is a nice example of where you might use the synthetic data rather than the published data from the annual population survey, if you're interested in the variation across different more detailed geographies. This is some more examples of where we can use our own data, our created synthetic data, to look at different things. So one of the key variables for the CIPHER consortium is, well, it's health outcomes. So we are interested in what the variation in health outcomes looks like when you look at different kind of health in all policies, different areas of interest. So if you look at the left-hand side, and here we've got small areas within Scotland on a hexagram, you can see we are representing SF12 mental component score. So this is a continuous score between 0 and 100, which represents the mental health of individuals, which we can then average out over different areas. Now, these data are not available to us in any other data set at the spatial resolution which we want to use them. So it gives you an example of something that you just can't get elsewhere than in our synthetic data set. And then if you look at the right-hand side, I did say I would come back to this map, and it's another nice example because it's a kind of composite variable here. So what we've got is something called employment deprivation across the Glasgow City region at data zone level. And employment deprivation is not just employment rate, it's also kind of the quality of employment as well. So what we've done here is we've kind of got a value added indicator, which allows us to look at the spatial distribution of what we call employment deprivation. And you can see patterns that, might not be surprising if you know the geography of Glasgow, but certainly would be useful if you wanted to do anything that was kind of looking at the statistical relationships between this as an outcome or as an input to a different model. So, to re-emphasize, the disaggregation of individual level variables is super important, but also the ability to create these kind of composite aggregated variables gives you a really powerful tool to do kind of further analysis. And that's the theme I'm expanding on a little bit in this slide. So again, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into the detail of a whole project that is using these data, but what we are doing at the moment is we're working on a classification which is at small area level, which is around how inclusive different zones are. So we've got 13 different variables which are variously related to how inclusive the economy of that zone is. So they start with things like employment, but we also look at accessibility, access to broadband. So across 13 variables, we've identified those that demonstrate whether an area is more or less inclusive in terms of its economic composition. Here, what we've done is we've run a clustering algorithm, so a k-means clustering algorithm in this case, and come out with a set of clusters for our small zones that use our synthetic data. And this solution, which is definitely work in progress at the moment, so this isn't the final output, but we've got clusters that are kind of more inclusive, less inclusive, have high exclusion from the labour market, have high unequal earnings and secure employment, for example. And just to give you a kind of an eyeball check of the relationship between these things and life expectancy, I'm flashing up a map on the right-hand side. And you can see that there is definitely some relationship between, for example, areas that have high exclusion from the labour market and lower healthy life expectancy. Rather unhelpfully, I've not put a legend on that map, I apologise, but green is higher healthy life expectancy and red is lower healthy life expectancy. And this is for Greater Manchester. So I'm a bit high level here with all of this explanation, but I'm trying to demonstrate that by combining variables that are not available from elsewhere that have come out of our synthetic data, we're able to create classifications, groupings, clusterings of interest that allow us to explain different outcomes. And certainly there is lots of work that could be done with this data set that sort of is within this vein. I'm going to do the same thing here, talk at a high level, because there is a whole work strand of CIPHER that's very interested in optimization and trying to work out, given a kind of finite budget of intervention, what gives you the kind of best outcomes. So here what we're looking at is circles that represent zones and data which is extracted from the synthetic data set. And you can run kind of optimization experiments which are aimed at reducing inequalities and driving down and improving well-being through driving down well-being inequality. And this is an example of where the synthetic data are being input into different models, and the combination of variables that's available to you allows you to pull different levers and tweak those variables to try and give you an optimal solution for improving well-being. So I'm going to expand a bit more on that theme, which is synthetic data into other models. So here, what we're going to talk about is those synthetic data which are now available as an input to other dynamic models. And this is another work stream of the CIPHER Consortium that I lead on. So if you think about our whole population, our whole synthetic population as being individual with a spatial component, we then can use those data as input to other dynamic models. So I'm showing you here a piece of work that's currently ongoing, which is where we're using our synthetic data as an input to a dynamic model, which measures the association between a policy intervention on household disposable income and mental health outcomes represented through short form 12 mental component score. So because we've got attribute rich information at small area zone, we've got a lot of information about individuals and areas that relate to things that we know are associated between income and mental health. So for example, improving neighborhood safety improves mental health, improving housing quality, reducing loneliness, improving nutrition, reducing tobacco consumption, all improve mental health. And we know that those things do change as household disposable incomes change as well. And there are a whole series of policy levers that we can pull to try and get us to kind of different scenarios of the future. So I'm going to show you two slides here, which are pieces of work that we're currently working on for Scotland. So the first one is where we're using our synthetic population as an input to the model, which looks at the effects that are on mental health of hitting Scottish Government poverty targets by 2030. So there is a target that's been set by the Scottish Government that they will have fewer than 10% of children living in families that are in relative poverty. And what we're showing here is that if you initiate a model with a synthetic population and you hit that target very quickly, so by 2030, you can achieve a 5% improvement in mental health outcomes for that particular population. Even though it's expensive per head, you do see a marked improvement in mental health. And this is a similar sort of policy experiment, but here what we're looking at is another policy lever that's available, which is around Scottish child payments. So within Scotland, eligible households, which are households on universal credit or other legacy benefits, where there is a child in the house, receive £25 per child. And we've modelled the effect that doubling that to £50 would have. And you can see that you'd get a 0.6 improvement in the mental health outcomes for that particular subgroup. So again, rather than focusing on the results themselves, trying to give you a feel for the way that these data can be used in more kind of dynamic contexts where you're kind of interested in having good input data sets for models. And then the last example that I would like to go through with you is just an example of where you disaggregate this back down again. So I've just shown you two sets of results, which are kind of the average aggregate effects of doing something across an entire population for Scotland. But here, if we go back down to the data zone level in Glasgow again, and this is a completely different model this time. This is a model which assesses the improvement in mental health from the energy price cap. So this is the national policy which capped energy prices as energy prices were rapidly increasing. And what I'm showing on the left is the average effect, which is that if you just let those prices increase without any kind of government help, you get quite large, well, small effects, but very rapid decline in mental health outcomes on average. So as you take money away or people get poorer because they're spending more money on energy, their mental health declines, which is probably not surprising. But the blue line is the relative effect of actually capping those energy prices. So where it gets interesting from an analysis point of view using the synthetic data is when you can go back down to the spatial again. So if we're looking at the right-hand side, this is data zones in Glasgow, and you can see that there are areas that benefit more from the support. So certain areas are seeing a far larger sort of mental health protection from energy price support than other areas. So again, hopefully a bit of an example of where these data can tell us something at a spatially disaggregated level that we otherwise wouldn't be able to get at. Okay, so last couple of slides, I want to talk through some of the access and kind of getting hold of these data. So there are kind of two routes here. If you wanted the data straight away, there's a slightly torturous process which involves linking the synthetic data file to the survey data which sit within the UK data service. So here what you would do is contact me for the lookup, which is that 2-column zone person ID file. You then have to register with the UK data service, agree to the conditions and download Understanding Society data, and then merge that lookup file with those Understanding Society data. And I can supply the R code to do that, which is fine. And if that's what you wanted to do, we can sort of help facilitate that. But, and this is most certainly my preferred route, if you could wait a couple of weeks, and I say a couple of weeks because we've had this kind of in review for a little while, so we are approaching the point at which it's going to be released. We're going to make the full data deposit available via the UK data service. So this is the kind of validated data product which has been built in collaboration and with review from the UK data service and also the Understanding Society team. And will come complete with a large technical user manual, which goes into far more detail, some of the things that I talked about in the first half of this presentation. It's undergoing those final reviews and checks. I'm hoping it's going to be made available. As I say, if you can wait a couple of weeks, this will be a much cleaner and smoother transition into using these data than asking for the link files and the R code, etc., etc. But both are possible. So my last slide before I open up for questions and comments is just to point you at a couple of resources for further information. I'm fairly sure we can probably share these somewhere else as links, but there is a nice 5-minute video that sits on the CIPHER website, and that explains kind of what is the spatial microsimulation, how have we done it, etc., etc. So that's well worth a look if you want some more information. And then if you really want the technical detail, I can point you at the scientific data article, which gives you the methodology and the validation. And then, as I say, when the UK data service deposit is available, there's also a technical user manual that's going to go alongside it. So the last thing for me to say is that we have a huge number of policy partners and academic partners within CIPHER, and it's really is a team effort to create and use these data products. And thank you very much to our funders. So this CIPHER consortium is funded by a UK Prevention Research Partnership award, which is a collaboration of a whole range of funders, which you can see on the slide here. So on that note, thank you very much for listening, and I'd love to hear questions and comments.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nick. That was really exciting. And I have no questions in the Q&A, so I can be... Oh, there is one. Fantastic. So is the census data you use also individual level? Is question number 1.
Good question, and no, it's not. So the census data are always area level, and they're always the area level summaries that are available, because if you imagine the constraints that we need, we always need to add up to something, and the something that we add up to needs to be the spatially detailed information at data zone or LSOA level. And they're also we always use the open access data as well for the census, so there is no secure microdata or individual level microdata used in any of this stuff.
Okay, brilliant. You've answered the LSOA level question, I think, in your answer already. So Stephen has a question. Has there been any work on also bringing in variables from other data sets, such as Active Lives, Health Service for England, etc.?
That's a really great question, because we spent an awfully long time at the beginning of the project discussing where we should be bringing the data in from in the first place. So the short answer is no, we haven't done that, because what we wanted to do was have a consistent pipeline through the survey we chose, the constraints and the data outputs, and Understanding Society fit the bill because we needed good health outcomes, and we also needed the kind of the large scale policy areas that are available to us. So short answer is no, but the longer answer is that using these methodologies, you could incorporate and bring in further information. So I don't want to go too off-piste here, but in a completely different project, we've done quite a lot of work, which is using propensity score matching techniques to attach additional variables from other surveys. So where you have a good view of the variables of interest and where your targets align, age, sex, ethnicity, employment, etc., you can actually match on additional variables. And I think there's quite a lot of work that people could do if they wanted additional information there. So I could probably talk about that for a long time, but no is the answer.
And Niels Blom has a question, really interesting in constructing the synthetic data sets. Did you also include region or other geographical info as a constraint? Is the synthetic data set performing better in some regions than in others?
Good. I'm going to stop saying good question, but that is a good question because we also spent a long time. So the first data set that we created had region as a dummy or a constraint. And the problem with having region as a constraint was that we when you produce the maps of certain variables, you really distinctly saw the regional boundaries. So it actually didn't give us enough variability to get a really good heterogeneous data set. So what we argue in the paper is that because we use quite a lot of constraints and people are with certain characteristics live across the country, that we dropped the geographical constraints. So those synthetic individuals, so someone living in a Yorkshire zone might well have come from the Northwest, for example, but they have the characteristics we need. So you get far more flexibility and a much more optimal solution. That's the advantage of not having spatial constraints. And then whether it performs better for some regions than others, I think it remains to be seen in anger for some of this, but we're finding that it's on average and across the board it's very good. It's giving us the distinctions that you might expect. But where we're really interested in answering questions like rural fuel poverty, we're finding that because we are pulling in individuals who might not live in rural regions or such rural regions, especially if we're looking in kind of the most rural parts of Scotland, we might be a bit constrained there. So there is probably, if there were another round, you could have bespoke populations that had very, very specific kind of urban rural type constraints.
Okay, brilliant. George Economides asks, you've talked about the data reliability of individual data columns. What about the reliability of correlations within the synthetic population or between the synthetic population and other data sets? How might your users control for these issues in their work with the synthetic population?
Yeah, so there are the correlations within the data are good where we've been able to validate. So, for example, when we're looking at things like employment and mental health, we're finding that the correlations within the data are good, and also the simulated annealing algorithm that we use. So you've got this set of individual targets, but you also can include cross tabulated targets as well. So for example, there you've got age by sex. So that is an enforced correlation that is driving the data distribution. So I think on the whole, for a lot of the variables where we're confident, the correlations hold within the data set. And that's an area of exploration for us because we actually want to start explaining the relationship between variables at small area. We have done a lot of work as well, so I did touch on it, but the sort of the correlation between the variables that we've produced and external data is looking good on the whole. So in the paper we talk about correlation with the ONS MSOA level estimates of income and our income, correlations with the IMD in different domains of the IMD. So we've done quite a lot of that external validation work, but just to push it back to the user, while we're confident and we have done the validation and we've tried to be as open as possible, I think where you want to ask specific questions of the data, you do need to do a whole piece of validation before you kind of merrily jump in. But that would be the same if you were going to understanding society and just using the underlying data and the weights. So I think there's no difference there.
Okay, I apologize. This was not a question from George. This was a question from Roger Witter, but I only saw that after I had posed the question. So now we have a question from somebody anonymous. In your opinion, what are the main types of policy questions the synthetic population is particularly well suited to address? Could you give a specific example?
So I think from a CIPHER point of view, we are very interested in health outcomes. So, for example, in which areas would you see the greatest improvement in SF12 mental and SF12 physical health if you were to improve the housing situation by providing good quality, affordable homes? That's the sort of question that I think the synthetic data is well set up to answer in and of themselves. Where we're using them in other models, the point is that we're actually drawing on the strengths of the Understanding Society longitudinal data. So again, very much with health outcomes in mind, because that's what CIPHER is doing. The examples of the dynamic models that I showed are asking questions that are kind of leveraging on disposable incomes. So it's saying if you were able to improve the disposable income of certain subgroups or certain household subgroups, what does that do to health? So physical, mental, quality adjusted life year improvement, that kind of thing. Then to throw it back, it's sort of that there are lots of questions in lots of other domains that we don't have the capacity to ask at the moment. So I think there's loads of other things that you could do with this.
Okay, Estela Barbosa is asking two questions. I'm going to read them one after the other, and you can answer them together. Could you, as well as use propensity score matching, consider imputation as treat additional variables as missing to bring in additional information from other data sources? And secondly, and how good is this synthetic population data set for policy or intervention evaluation?
I mean, the answer to the second question is I would like to think good, because that's part of the reason for doing it in the first place. And certainly those examples where I was drawing on the input to the dynamic models are kind of policy questions that we know are of interest to Public Health Scotland and the Scottish Government. So, you know, I'd hope that they're a very powerful tool to use in that kind of arena. When we're talking about propensity score matching, I'm trying to unpick what you mean by the treatment of additional variables as missing. So I think if I try and paraphrase what I think you mean. So you've got target variables from external data sets that you know exist in your synthetic data. So I'll keep saying age, sex, ethnic group, employment, etc. But there are other variables that you don't have, but in your synthetic data that you do have in external data. And I think that's the point of using those propensity score matching type approaches, because they are variables that you want to import to attach to your synthetic data. So they're by default missing in the underlying data, the synthetic population. Sorry, I might have misunderstood that question, but yeah.
Well, if Estella, if you want anything more, just put it in the Q&A box. And another anonymous, are you using Census 21 data? And if so, are there any limitations due to the impacts of the pandemic on some data, such as employment?
So yes, there is an updated version of this, which is 2021 census data. The kind of the core product is 2011 because it's consistent across England, Wales, Scotland, because of course Scotland census is 2022 data. So we've got a mixture of pandemic and not so pandemic answers. So I think, yes, there definitely are limitations when we're looking at the 2021 data. I mean, there are limitations no matter which way you look at it, but the 2021 data probably are problematic. We haven't done detailed kind of analysis of that, but there is lots of work to be done on those data anyway. You know, if you think about the travel to work statistics and everything else that were affected by the pandemic, it's a pandemic census, so I think you have to treat it as such.
Okay. Question from Niels, who said, thank you for answering your question before, I presume. Another question, was the construction of the dataset able to deal with a different end depending on whether you use household or individual level information for the construction? Because the census provides different ends depending on whether it is household or individual level. For instance, by looking at the gender composition of an LSOA compared to the housing type of an LSOA.
That's a very good question. So the majority of the ends come from the population tables. Some of the ends come from the household tables, so the household composition, for example. So it's a good point, but I think that the quicker answer is that the majority of the totals are reliant on the population totals. With a bit of adjustment to make sure that everything adds up, because all of your targets do have to add up to the same number. So it's in the iteration that we're showing here, very much an individual synthetic population. As a slight aside, again, we have done the same exercise for households. So if you think about the structure of understanding society, you've got individual PIDs, person IDs, but you also have HIDs, household IDs, and you can do exactly the same methodology, but instead of pulling through PIDs, you pull through HIDs and you can create whole households. But when we created the version that I've talked about primarily here, we're very interested in individual level outcomes. So there is other things that you could do if you wanted to.
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges, isn't it? That some of the interventions are household level, but the outcomes are individual level. And is there that interaction there? I'm going to ask the anonymous question first. Estella, if your two questions are answered, just put a thumbs up under them. If not, I'll ask them afterwards. So anonymous, what are the key sources of uncertainty inherent in the synthetic population, and how might these impact the interpretation of model results?
That's a good modeling question, isn't it? So we've got uncertainty in the data. So we've done our best to pull through the largest number of observations that's possible from understanding society, but there are kind of missing observations and that kind of thing. And then you've got the kind of sampling frame for the survey itself. So we know that there is a bias in kind of the respondents and that kind of thing. So there is sort of data uncertainty that's pulled through. A quick note on that, actually, the reweighting that's done because we're using the census targets actually gives us quite good certainty about the summation, but you do end up in a few cases where you've got kind of very slightly unusual combinations of attributes replicating individuals quite often. So there is a bit of an issue there, whereby if you just don't have the observations that fits all of the target constraints, you can end up with quite a lot of replication of individuals. But we've done some analysis of that, and it's never, I'm going to say too bad because I can't remember what the number is, but it's never terrible. So that's there. The algorithm itself is probabilistic. So I think if you reran the algorithm again, you would have slightly different distributions. So if you were to keep recreating this synthetic population over and over again, you would have slightly different combinations of individuals. We are fairly comfortable with that because I think on average and in the round, when you look at the fit to the constraints, it's very good. But there is certainly uncertainty if you think about the model uncertainty there. You could get around it by running it 100 times and taking averages, but whether you can have average people is a different matter, because it works in my mind if you're trying to create area level numbers, but it doesn't work if you're trying to create individual populations. So I think at some point you have to decide which model run you're working with. And I'm trying to think about a good answer for sort of uncertainty and outcomes, but I'm going to take you back to my kind of hierarchical view of how assured we are about the population and its distributions. And I think we are far more certain in the outputs where we've got good constraint data at both origin and target. We're far less certain in the outputs where it's variables that we haven't looked at and validated because there are hundreds and hundreds of them, and we could never validate kind of, preferences to visit different types of coastal locations on holiday. There is so much information in there that we just haven't been able to validate. So I think, again, pushing back to the user, if you've got a use case for these data, I think you do need to do something around validation and quantification of uncertainty if possible at that point.
Okay, so there's a comment, I think, from Estella about EQ5D. I'm not sure what it relates to, but it's probably
it's hard, isn't it, talking to the chat box. But I think this is where, we're saying we haven't simulated EQ5D, but you could get EQ5D from somewhere else. So you could attach EQ5D, presumably because, well, actually, there are some really nice papers translating SF12 to EQ5D, where you, gosh, it's a well-cited paper. We've used it because to get us at quality adjusted life years, you actually need a utility score that comes from EQ5D, and we use SF12, and we use this paper calculation to generate EQ5D utility scores, and then we produce our qualies. So I think that was part of the answer we were talking about, where you have information you want and information that you don't necessarily have at this point.
Okay, brilliant. There are no more questions in the Q&A box. So I'm going to ask Nick my questions later because they're quite specific. And well, then that leaves me to just thank you all for attending the webinar. As I said, it's recorded and it will be available on the CECAN website in 2 or 3 days. For you to watch and to share with your colleagues, maybe. And I hope to see you all at the next CECAN webinar. So thank you very much for attending and take care. Bye. Oh, and of course, thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Corinna. Thanks.
Really
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.